Alright, so hello everyone and welcome to what's going to be the second revival of the podcast. I am Pro 1000 and today we are going to begin the grand, long-awaited podcast 118. A lot has happened since mid-July. It is now August 16th. It is almost noon in the afternoon, and we are going to jump in. So first things first, there was a Nintendo Direct on July 20th, 2020. Basically, the major takeaway from it, because I'm going to heavily summarize it, because as you know, I'm not even remotely close to when it actually happened, is that Atlus and Nintendo reaffirmed that Shin Megami Tensei 5 will be coming to the West. It is still in development, and it is currently aiming for a 2021 launch date. Now, the other thing that was also a part of this release, or I'm sorry, this stream, was that Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, which is a very famous game for some very difficult fights, will be re-releasing on the Nintendo Switch as Nocturne HD, and something that they added later, recently actually, by about a few days or so. Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne HD will have Dante in it. One of the original releases, I think in the West, had Dante in it. And basically, I think a couple other releases didn't have it. It was sort of like a one-off thing. And they will have Dante in it. However, you must buy it for $10. So if you want to get the full traditional original experience, you'll be able to get Dante for $10 as like a little side DLC. Definitely a little expensive for one summon, but needless to say, part of the appeal is that Dante is it. Dante from Devil May Cry, of course. I don't really think I need to elaborate, but just in case you are a fan of Dante's Inferno, it is Dante from Capcom's Devil May Cry series. Probably going to be a pretty hot DLC because, again, of who it is, and also the original traditional fact and content of the game. Now, I believe Dante was replaced in other versions with another character, another summon. I'm not too familiar with this because I am not too familiar with the game as a whole. However, I'm not sure if he's just going to be added or if he's going to be, you're going to replace that summon. It would be cool to, I'm a guy who likes complete editions of games. I like having everything as a part of everything. So for me personally, I prefer if it was both, but I digress. Again, like I said, not too familiar with the game. Let the fans of the game really speak to that. But I always say more content is usually a better thing, especially when it comes to characters and whatnot. Giving people the option of having choice is fantastic. So now that I've done that, let us fast forward 3 days later to the Xbox Series X event. Now, I actually live streamed this on both my YouTube and Twitch channels. We talked about a lot of stuff on that live stream. To really summarize it, and obviously everyone has seen the memes that have come out since then, Halo Infinite was the first thing that they showed off. It is Microsoft's biggest upcoming title. They are definitely putting all the guns behind it. 343 is putting all the works behind it, and it has become the center of a massive internet campaign citing the graphics as being poor, including one specific brute, which I believe has now been called Craig the Brute because of its meme popularity. So what 343 has come out and said, this was about a week or so ago from today, is that they are delaying the game due to, I think they said COVID, which is, unfortunately now I've already messed up this. That's going to totally get this video completely banned. But they're going to delay the game, not because of the criticism, although I think it's safe to say that they are going to delay it, at least in part because of that. We don't know how the current worldwide event is going to affect that. However, it is likely that that plays a role in addition to the graphics. Other games that they showed off, and I'm just going to really quickly read it off, are State of Decay 3, Forza Motorsport, Everwild, Ori and the Will of the Wisps will get a Series X update. Outer Worlds Peril on Gorgon will get a DLC on September 9th. Grounded, which is a game, Grounded already came out actually, and Avowed are games by Obsidian. Obsidian, of course, known for their work on Fallout New Vegas, as well as The Outer Worlds. Psychonauts is going to be getting a sequel, and all current Destiny 2 expansions will come to Game Pass, while the new Destiny 2 expansion Beyond Light will debut on November 10th. Stalker 2 will also be a game. It's coming out. The zone will now be fully open world. It will use the A-Life 2.0 system, where the state of the world, characters, and mutants will be influenced even when the player isn't present to witness it. It will have a branching story with multiple endings, and it's GSC's biggest game by far. Warhammer 40K will be getting a game, Warhammer 40K Darktide, Tetris Effect Connected, The Gunk, The Medium, Phantasy Star Online, and Crossfire. Now, if you want more about this, I did do a stream on this very event. It wasn't too exciting after the first couple of games. It was more just a couple of news. Stalker 2, Psychonauts, Forza, and Halo being the big ones. State of Decay 3, I know has at least, I think I have 2 friends who are interested in it, and one who's actually excited. But beyond that, very simple and straightforward event, and Halo is delayed as a result. Now, there will also be a new Leisure Suit Larry game. Leisure Suit Larry, Wet Dreams Dry Twice, will be coming out on October 15th. For those of you who don't know, it's an old school style game, which I guess by today's standard we could say is a boomer game that is specifically about Larry Laffer and his endless quest to triumph and conquest over Punani. Let's say that, because that's pretty PG, if I'm not mistaken. There was a State of Play on August 6, 2020. I believe I also streamed that. I do not have notes about it because I do not think anything interesting really came from it. I might be forgetting those, so feel free to yell at me if I did forget something, either in the comments or in Discord. Beyond Good and Evil is getting a Netflix feature film adaptation. At this point, I'd like to remind everybody that Beyond Good and Evil 2 still does not have a solid release date. Ubisoft has been playing it very close to the chest, teasing this game at various intervals over the last decade or so. I believe the first Beyond Good and Evil 2 screenshots came out originally in 2007, if not 2008. And since then, the series has been off and on. The game probably has entered some form of development hell since its original incarnation. I believe it was in 2018 or 2017 they first re-revealed the game, and the following year they had a trailer showing that Jade, the protagonist of the first game, would appear to be in an antagonistic role in this game, which is a prequel. So it's very interesting to try and see where this universe is going to go. However, remembering that the original game came out as far back as 2003, it's sort of one of those weird cases where it's a game that was popular when it came out for being a little different, but at the same time, I'm not sure how well it will do in the modern day. It'll probably do fairly well, but most of the fans of it hopefully will return for it, which when you don't have constant releases with a series like Kingdom Hearts, it's a little bit hard to try and maybe resummon them all, but I'm interested in it and I have high hopes for it. Ubisoft has rarely let me down, even though despite the fact that I kind of do enjoy their work to this day, with the exception of things like Breakpoint, which I skipped, as well as a couple other games and franchises that they have also not brought back, like Rayman and Prince of Persia, I still like Ubisoft, and I still think that the Assassin's Creed games that they have produced have been some of the better ones in the past. However, we now have to take a step, and as it has become to be known, Ubisoft has been making a lot of missteps recently, and they're basically more or less the focus of this podcast, I would say. And actually, before I get to that, in the same vein as Beyond Good and Evil getting a Netflix feature film, Ubisoft and Netflix will team up to create an adult animated Splinter Cell series written by the John Wick writer. On top of this, and I will add this to my notes currently right here, so that way if I ever go back to this, Sam Fisher will be joining Rainbow Six as an operator. Let me actually type. I can't speak and type. I'm sorry. I'm very stupid in that regard. And unfortunately for Splinter Cell fans, they have been teasing Sam Fisher left, right, and center. He had a cutscene in Ghost Recon Wildlands. He's constantly featured. He was in a game that Ubisoft also showed off at the Ubisoft Forward event, the mobile game where he was working alongside El Sueño. However, Sam Fisher's last game took place in 2013 with Splinter Cell Blacklist. So it has been essentially 7 years since Sam Fisher has had his own title, and instead has been making, alternate appearances in various other Ubisoft games. And I think I don't even really need to speak for the community. I think it's very well known that people want a Rainbow Six game. I'm sorry. People want a new Splinter Cell game, whether it is a reboot or a continuation of the story of Splinter Cell after Blacklist. People want more Sam Fisher. I think there is a huge market demand for it. Metal Gear Solid has since been retired. In fact, that was one of the points that Sam Fisher talked about in his, I say like he's a real human. That was one of the things that was referenced in his Wildlands appearance, that he knew another guy with a bandana who finally hung it up and retired, in reference to Konami and Kojima's departure from the Metal Gear series and Konami proceeding to let it stagnate after Metal Gear Survive. They have already kind of hinted it and teased it, and what would be nice is if the people at Ubisoft would recognize that there is a demand for it, and needless to say, deliver a game, a good game, to the fans so that they know that the series is still alive and well. Maybe even a reboot if they feel that the story is getting too bloated. However, if I remember correctly, Blacklist ended on not necessarily a cliffhanger, but definitely some degree of sequel bait, that there will be a continuation to it at some point in the future. Alright, now that we have talked about roughly, there's a couple things I'm going to talk about after this, including a couple of very serious topics, which we're actually about to talk about serious topics. So the first thing is not that egregious, and like I said, we will get to the serious allegations regarding Ubisoft. I do not have, I lost the document I had that had all of it open. I have some of the points here. Needless to say, this has probably been covered 1,000 times over by better YouTubers who do more investigative work than I do. But first things first, Ubisoft's pricing for their 2020 fall games will remain at $60. This again comes off the line of NBA 2K21 saying that they will have next-gen games available for $70. Now, I have given my opinion on that. I have spoken about that. I believe that was last podcast's major topic, so forgive me if I'm retreading ground here, but I personally feel that raising the price of video games is a mistake, and I'm not just saying that as a consumer. There are some games, indeed, that could be argued that are worth more than $60 based on the amount and quality of content contained within. So, for instance, when we talk about a game, I'm going to take a random one. Actually, there's a very easy one. When we take a game like Ghost of Tsushima, which is a game I recently had the pleasure of playing and I finished, it has some of the best graphics on the console. It has some really tight and interesting gameplay. It's not perfect, but if someone made the argument to me that Ghost of Tsushima is more like a $70 game based on all the content within, I would agree. However, that's really only an opinion that you can form about a game after the fact. And if you buy it for that amount of money and you feel that it is worth that amount of money, then great. I mean, I guess things worked out. But the unfortunate side effect of doing this, because $60 has been a staple of how much games have cost for at least the last decade and a half, if not more, is that you will encourage everybody to bloat their prices up to $70 because they will want to make the exact same profit. Now, there will be exceptions, such as remasters like THQ Nordic SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom. However, if the quality of the game, if the story of the game, if the gameplay are not up to snuff, people are going to feel that their money is wasted. And ultimately, it might lead to some games being completely looked over because people aren't sure if it's a worthy price tag. And that's kind of partially why we have seen so many side games like Singularity and other things just disappear, is because nobody wants to take the risk on it. People would rather double down on the big money grabs that will make them a lot of money. So what it will ultimately do is increase the price of games, and a lot of smaller games might not even be made. And indeed, a lot of smaller games have already stopped being made. There will never be a Sleeping Dogs sequel. There will never be a sequel. Well, there hasn't been a sequel to Deus Ex. I digress. And what I do not want to see is that people go into a $70 game thinking that they're going to get, you know, what's the high quality game, right? Cyberpunk, right? Pretend it's like a 100 out of 100, it's $70. People are going to go into lesser games that cost the same amount with that same level of quality in their mind, and when they don't get that out of the game, whether because the game is bad or it's just not in the same vein and not in the same scope, they will decide, well, it's not worth buying these types of games anymore. And that will, unfortunately, probably hurt these types of games. $60, I think, sits on this very weird precipice of being reasonable enough that most games feel like they're worth it. But at the same time, people are willing to dole out the money even when the games aren't. And for instance, Resident Evil 3 this year was definitely not worth $60 in my opinion. I think most people can recognize that it's a glorified expansion pack for Resident Evil 2 Remake, which came out last year. And if I had known in advance what the limited scope of the game was going to be, I would not have even bought it for $60. I would have said, okay, this is more like a $30 game, and I'll pick it up when it's $30. And while it's nice and all to have people who buy games and who will review it, you know, forgetting the mainstream media, because you know my opinions on mainstream reviewers, it will still not be enough. There will be someone out there who gets scorned. They will feel like they wasted their money. And you know that game companies are not going to deliver $70 worth of anything to people. And that is not going to change. They're still going to deliver the microtransaction addled games. They're going to have a whole bunch of extra stuff that you don't want in your games. They're going to egregiously market stuff to you. I mean, some of the top games of all time have heavily invested in microtransactions. And while that doesn't mean they're bad games, that's the style of game that they're still going to get. They still make you buy these games for $60. You still get roughly in-game ads. I mean, that was something that was a controversy, I think, in an NBA game, or I think it might have been a 2K game or a FIFA game, that you were still getting ads in the game, even though you paid for it, right? Like, it's not like you got the game for free. That's something that I even say about Modern Warfare 2019, is that they constantly shill the battle pass to you, and I have purchased the game. I own the game. I do not want to be reminded constantly about it. Like, having notifications and daily messages showing it is cool, but when you pop it up in my face constantly, it starts to get a little annoying. And I fear that games will just start to cost $10 extra because people still want to play video games, and they'll just, you know, they'll capitulate to it. And I think 2K and Take-Two have realized this, and other companies are not stupid. If they can make an extra $10 per sale, they're going to do it. And in a couple of generations, we probably will not even be using physical mediums as the primary method of getting games. You'll probably need to download a game and then use it off of that, and that will probably be the primary method by which you get it. I mean, look at the current the shift that they're trying to make with the PlayStation 5, as well as other consoles in recent history too. I think there's an Xbox One model which doesn't even have a disc drive. I might be wrong. I know that, and there's other things like that. And I just do not want to see the price of games increase without quality increasing across the board to compensate. And I do not think game developers can or will do that responsibly, because there's a responsibility to the consumer that I feel gets violated a lot, and a lot of times it is a very subjective line. You might think that Resident Evil 3 is well worth the $60 because you got a ton of gameplay out of it. However, what I feel that is fair enough to say with certainty is that most people do not feel that way. And there's a lot of things that I'm in the minority about. You know, I think that there's a lot of games that I enjoy that I think are fine if people give it a try, that are more than great, but a lot of people don't like them. However, at least I could say that those games cost either less or about the same as every other game. And to just have a $10 hike would be kind of counterproductive. So now that I've probably retread all the ground that I made last podcast, Ubisoft said, and I'm quoting Jason Schreier, that their next-gen games this fall will be the same price as current-gen games, which is $60 US. So wherever else you are, you got to convert that. For me, with tax, it's like 65.31, I think. New York has some, I think, really high tax. New York is pretty bad at that. Take-Two announced that 2K21 will be $70 on PS5 and Xbox Series X. So if you are, and not to mention, I want to take note of the current climate, the global climate, the rampant, widespread event that is occurring currently, and they are going to pick this year of all years to ramp it up. And I get that they're a business, they got to make money. I mean, the easy counter to that is simply that 2K always makes money, and it's one of the best-selling games every year. The same thing with Call of Duty, which, by the way, Activision is still not officially announced. I think they've confirmed it, but there's been no trailer, no full announcement. So Modern Warfare may be here for another year, but I think they'll announce it. I mean, it's only halfway through August. They'll announce it this weekend just to spite this podcast specifically. They won't know it. There'll just be a thing in the universe that says, yep, this dude made this podcast. It always happens. That's why I delay the podcast so much, because big news always comes out. And then I'm like, well, shit, I could wait and see how it plays out, or I could do a podcast. But I digress. The point is that $60 is already kind of expensive. I mean, if you really consider it and you buy a lot of games every year, $60 adds up. I mean, that's not including the price of controllers, Xbox and PlayStation Live, or I'm sorry, Xbox Live and PlayStation Gold? PlayStation Plus? I think it's PlayStation Plus, yeah. You know, which is $60 a year, I believe. Controllers are like $65 or $60 a year. And not to mention these new next-gen consoles, I really think they're going to be over $500. I think, without a doubt, Microsoft and Sony are basically probably playing price limbo with each other to see how low they can go. And I do believe that at least one of them will be over $600. I don't know which. It might be Sony, because Sony kind of, you know, they're a little hurting for money, and Microsoft can kind of take some L's because they make so much money elsewhere. But I do fundamentally believe one, if not both, will be over 500, and maybe one, if not both, will also be over 600. It really depends. And that is not a great look when you want to also increase the price of your games by a sixth of what they currently are. So it remains to be seen. It will be a reoccurring topic on this podcast, I can tell you right now. There's good things I'm looking forward to with this gen, but there's also things I'm not looking forward to. And this is unfortunately one of the latter. Now, I'm going to talk about Ubisoft's recent, controversy, the news out of Ubisoft. Ubisoft, in particular, has had a history of its employees and the higher-ups mistreating and I would say abusing, not physically, but definitely either ignoring or I think mistreating is the proper word, their lower down employees, specifically with regards to gender and race. The one thing that I do want to talk about, because like I said, this podcast has been done better. It's called Other People's Podcasts. But the one thing that I do want to home in on is that Ubisoft, and specifically with regards to Assassin's Creed, has been forcing their companies and their developers to have straight white male protagonists extensively out of fear that women do not sell games. And that led to, I think, like a couple days worth of internet I don't want to say hysteria, but definitely internet conversation about the state of games. And it's only recently, with both Assassin's Creed Syndicate as well as and especially in 2018's Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where it was finally, you know, it was sort of kind of snuck under the rug that Cassandra was the favored protagonist by the studio. The novelization confirms her as the canon protagonist, depending how much you want to read into that in the lore of the franchise. And in general, they have flat out gone out of their way to sort of basically make her the poster character of the game. And I was an Alexios player in my extensively long playthrough of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I firmly believe that Alexios is the better of the two. This is an entirely subjective opinion based on my experiences and my personal characteristics. However, I will not deny that Cassandra is probably a very interesting and enjoyable character to play as, in the same vein as Alexios, because I believe the role that they fill, which is the Mystios, is unique and interesting in its own regard. With regards to Syndicate, I think it's a no-brainer. I think while Jacob Fry was at least kind of interesting, his story never really went anywhere, in my opinion, although that's not really to say much, because the story of Syndicate didn't really go anywhere to begin with, in my opinion, which is why I do not really like the game as a whole. And Evie Fry was definitely, in my opinion, the more fun protagonist to play as. But now, like I said, Syndicate, in my opinion, was not a very good game to begin with, so I kind of didn't really consider that much. I much preferred Odyssey, which I thought had way more to it and had a lot more going for it as well. Now, on the topic of forcing games to have straight white males as protagonists exclusively, extensively out of fear that women do not sell games, I think needless to say, female characters as the front runners of games do sell. There are innumerable amounts of franchises that feature female protagonists up front and center, and it is not a bad thing to have one. Now, whether or not it hurts sales numbers can be an objective thing that we can look at data for. However, there are tons of franchises that are big enough, I think, without actually deep diving the data of dozens upon dozens of franchises, it's safe to say that things like Tomb Raider and Metroid, as well as even the Beyond Good and Evil, which I mentioned earlier, are popular enough and successful enough to warrant getting sequel after sequel after sequel after sequel, especially in the case of Tomb Raider, which distinctly back in the mid-2000s was accused of being very sexist and went through a whole reboot where they sort of fixed that issue and the games were good again and people liked that. Metroid even had that at one point, ironically, with basically one game, as I have rambled on and on and on and on and on about over and over and over. I will not be redigging myself into the other end black hole. However, to say that games with women do not sell is not necessarily true. In fact, I would say that it's objectively false based on at least 5 or 6 different major franchises that heavily feature women at the front runner. For instance, Horizon Zero Dawn. One of the games I liked was Remember Me. Now that said, I'm going to take the opposite side into accounting and say that maybe the writers at Assassin's Creed, and while we know that this is not the case, maybe the writers feel more comfortable addressing their stories towards a male audience, a male demographic. Now, again, without sourcing data, perhaps the player base of Assassin's Creed is predominantly male, and out of fear of alienating their characters, they would rather have a male character, presumably male gamer, play as a male character. Now, again, I would cite, one, that it's not the writers that made this decision, and two, that there are innumerable other games which feature male protagonists, either series or standalone games, that have sold extensively well, gone on to receive accolades and awards, and been well loved by the community. But one thing that I do want to cite is that I want studios to create stories that they feel are right for the games that they are making. If they feel that their games are best served by having white male protagonists or just male protagonists, I want them to create the artistic vision that they feel is correct. I do not want them to take the stance that they need to include certain characters as main characters just because they fit a certain race, gender, creed, nationality, etc., etc. I want games to be good because of what the game is. I want it to tell a compelling story. You know, if that's the goal of the game, is to have a very deep and involving story. I want it to tell a story where the writers are able to, while expanding maybe their creative limits and doing so in a successful and comfortable way, are able to tell us something that is fully fleshed out in a fully realized world. The biggest instance that I can give of this would be Ghost of Tsushima, which is a game that takes place in 13th century Japan and features exclusively Asian characters, both Asian males and Asian females. And I feel that for that game, the storyline and the characters contained within it are some of the strongest in a game that I played in recent memory. And needless to say, because of that, the gameplay experience was augmented because we had such a strong basis to found it on. We had a character, Jin Sakai, who was very interesting. He has conflict within himself. He feels like a reasonably realistic person, whereas opposed to some other games, you know, maybe there's no conflict, there's just whatever. It feels like the character fit the game that was being created. And that said, I do not want people to just gender swap male characters because it will get them a few extra check marks on social media. And I have said this about movies in particular really seem to suffer from this, specifically the typical suspects of Star Wars and other science fiction and other franchises, Game of Thrones. And what makes more sense is that we have smart characters doing smart in-character things, and we have storylines that truly benefit from that. And in my opinion, that is how we reach a point where games and storylines become very fulfilling and satisfying to play through. And that does not have to be limited to male characters. You can have a female character go through something like that. You can have an animal go through something like that. Male or female, doesn't matter. You can have a male character go through something like that. And across races, across sexes, it's sort of almost a universal thing. a lot of people I've seen have said that the hero's journey is inherently male, and while we can maybe trace down the roots of it, I think there's a certain degree of things like honor and duty that are almost sort of inherently inside everybody. Everybody loves someone, they love something, and they love the ideals that they want to stand for. And when you have a game that truly capitalizes on that feeling, you can have plot lines that aren't necessarily linked to sex and race, but are still fulfilling to write and to ponder and to see over. So how does this relate to Ubisoft? I think it's bad that Ubisoft, especially the higher-ups, distinctly said, yes, we want this, we need this, we absolutely have to have this. However, in the case of a game like Assassin's Creed Origins, I much preferred the game to focus on Bayek, and Bayek as a character, even though his wife Aya plays a role in the game and is actually playable at a few different portions of the game, I much preferred that the game chose to focus on one character specifically. And this was one of the criticisms I had of Odyssey, is that Odyssey, because you're meant to be either Cassandra or Alexios, while I am grateful that they gave that choice, because personally I think that Alexios was a very hilarious character at points, but also had serious moments in the story, I feel that there's something lost when you have sort of a character that's not fleshed out and defined. There's a very big difference between Jin Sakai and Bayek, and then, you know, at the middle of the scale you have like Alexios and Cassandra, and then I guess as an example on the far end of the scale you have a complete creative character like, I don't know, the protagonist of a Fire Emblem game, which is commonly called the Avatar because you can fully customize them, or Commander Shepard from Mass Effect. You have a character that you really definitively have on one end of the scale. There, you can't customize them maybe beyond outfits or something like that. You know, they are written a certain way, and these are the characters I generally like. Self-inserting is nice, but what's nicer is when you have a character who feels like a part of their backstory is constantly being brought forth in the game. So for instance, in the case of Bayek, as a former Medjay, the final Medjay, he not only takes his Medjay teachings and uses it to found the Assassin's Order, but it also makes sense in the terms of him helping people out. You know, he's a protector of the people. It fits within his own character, and as a character, I really enjoyed getting to know him, feeling and witnessing his triumphs as well as his defeats. Same thing goes for Jin Sakai. I feel like having Jin be a definitive character, a samurai, a protector of the people, was a very strong choice. It fits with the side quests. A lot of things start to fall in place when you realize he's here to protect his people, and throughout the game he constantly reaffirms that he wants to protect the people of Tsushima from the invading Mongols, and that is a very, very, very strong point for that game, which is why the story, in my opinion, was very enjoyable. Now with Odyssey, you get a little hazy with it because you're just a mercenary. You're not really there to protect people, and that's not to say that every game you should be a protector, but it's definitely a harder hook to sink when you do not have that sort of narrative backing. So you just kind of play as this person wandering the world looking for cultists to kill. And yeah, there's missions and stuff that lead you to cultists. You know, usually they're involved somehow, which relates back to it, and that's cool, and that's, you know, that's fine, that's great, nothing wrong with that. But it's a stronger story when you have that sort of narrative binding. And if they had maybe focused on Alexios, they could have had the things that make Alexios. Yeah, they could have had more Alexios-based things. So maybe Alexios likes, I don't know, sweet foods. So one of the side quests is him having sweet foods, and then he can maybe reminisce on his past when he was with his family, because family is a big theme in Odyssey, and it's actually the whole arcing plot line between you and trying to rescue everyone in your family and reunite them. That could have been a touching thing, because both of the other games I mentioned have stuff like that. But at that point, you kind of enter the Commander Shepard territory where you're kind of just filling a mold. You're not really establishing story and rolling with it. And that's why I feel like it's cool to offer the choice. But in a narrative-based franchise like Assassin's Creed, I feel that having one distinct storyline is much better. And to be fair, Assassin's Creed has had female protagonists. However, their mainline games have either been shared roles or exclusively male. And the sole exception to that is Odyssey, where you have a choice. And while, like I said, I appreciate the choice, there has never been a standalone mainstream Assassin's Creed featuring a woman. Now, I get people want it. I feel like the writing at Assassin's Creed is good enough to do it. I was not a huge fan of whatever the Liberation lady was, Aveline. I wasn't a huge fan of Assassin's Creed 3 or Liberation. And Freedom Cry takes place with a character from 4. And, oh crap, what are the other games again? Unity was kind of a shit show. I kind of disregard Unity as a whole. Even though the story was okay, it was very bland and typical. And Syndicate got even worse. You know, Rogue has its sort of feel. And I like Shay Cormac. The only problem is that he's kind of definitively like a throwaway. I think they really kind of screwed up the timeline of releases. And Assassin's Creed can do it. And I believe that they will do it someday. And to some people, that someday is not a good enough answer. It's they want it immediately. They want it right away. And I think specifically with Assassin's Creed, I think that's a bad idea. I think we've seen what happens when they rush Assassin's Creed games, namely Unity and Syndicate. I think that is definitively the wrong thing to do for Ubisoft, is to force them to release a game flat out and fast and quick. They are better when they take the time to understand and analyze their franchise, which is, in my opinion, why Origins and Odyssey are so good. And why I like them so much as games is because they take a step back to analyze, or rather copy The Witcher. Fine, we could say that. But they take a step back to analyze why that formula is so fun, and then find unique ways to mix it up. And that's kind of similar to what Ghost of Tsushima did, although it's not a series. Sucker Punch, I do feel, took a lot of notes from Assassin's Creed and found ways to make it a very interesting and innovative experience. And while representation is nice, the one thing that I personally prefer is to have a game that is good, no matter what it is. And while having a game that is good with a diverse protagonist is a cool thing to have, and I would never say no to it, I would rather have a good game than a game with representation that's average to poor. And that is just my opinion. You might prefer to see diversity, but in the hopes that the game makes a profit so studios will be inclined to continue doing it, I want them to do stuff like that. And specifically in 2012, that's what happened with Telltale's The Walking Dead. Now, what happened to Telltale after that was a complete other, that's not related to that. But specifically with, I believe it was Dave Fennoy. I might be saying his name wrong. I might have the wrong person. I didn't really look it up. And I didn't plan out this. There's never a script really for any of this. There's notes. That's it. That's something that they do have. And I would be all for something like that. But at the end of the day, a game has to be good. It has to have a good product. And especially if your game is going to be narrative-based, which is truly where this really matters, because if it's just whatever multiplayer, usually nowadays they do have that option to play as a female, play as people of various races and both sexes. They do have that. And I would prefer that the product be good, and especially if the product is narrative-based, the story be good. And that's precisely the reason I did not buy The Last of Us 2, but I did buy Ghost of Tsushima, because based on my knowledge of the former, I did not want to buy it after the leaks, and based on my ignorance of the latter, I did buy it and firmly enjoy it. So what Ubisoft did, to bring it all around full and center again, what Ubisoft did by forcing their protagonists to be this way and dictating it to their studios is 100% wrong. It's very troublesome that they would feel the need to do that, as opposed to letting the writing and the creative teams make what they feel is best. And I understand appealing to market, but there is a sizable portion of... I try to separate mobile games. This is just a personal thing on a side note. Like, people like to bring up mobile games and, casual gaming on the same level as, I don't want to say hardcore, but you know what I mean, like console games. And it is under the umbrella of gaming, but there is sort of a different approach. Mobile games are loaded with microtransactions, loaded with tons of crazy stuff. I'm talking specifically about console releases and obviously PC releases of console games as well. And I feel that having creative teams make the ideal game that they want to make, regardless of what that actually entails, is the best idea. And now maybe sometimes they will feel that the best idea is to have a straight white male, although, like I said before, there's a lot of games now where you can be bisexual as much as you want. Fire Emblem is one of those, Odyssey is one of those, and when it suits the character, it's understandable. When it's a player choice, or like a player created avatar, I think it should always be an option. That way, if you don't feel comfortable doing bisexual things, you don't have to. Or it's bisexual things. If you don't feel comfortable having same-sex relationships or encounters in a game, you do not have to. Whereas if you do, or if you just want to see both options, it's totally fine. It should be an option always for both male and female. The same thing is definitely Fire Emblem, I think, has had this since Fates, maybe? I'm not too familiar with Awakening. Any game with an avatar should have that. But when you are telling the definitive story of a character that has been written out and thought out ahead of time, I think that there should not be an overbearing hand telling you how they must be, other than well written and likable and, at least enjoyable to watch and play as and experience. But other than that, it should be entirely up to how the writer feels that they will best fit into this world, and in general how they should best associate and accommodate themselves into the story, or accommodate these characters into the story. And that's all I really want to say. As ranty as that is, that's kind of what I feel it should be. Ubisoft forcing their hand is frankly pretty sad and disgusting, because as I have had numerous issues with the way Ubisoft has run Assassin's Creed. As a fan of this series since 2009, when Assassin's Creed I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. When Assassin's Creed 2 came out, and definitely around the time of Black Flag, I really started to get into this series. I really do feel that that is the wrong thing to do. And while with other franchises, you have Sam Fisher from Splinter Cell. Division is kind of an Avatar game. I don't know why I thought of that. Rayman is not even human, and they don't even make his games anymore. You see how these problems really compound with Ubisoft. I really get tired of it, honestly. Why can't we just get Rayman 4? Like, seriously, I know they made the side-scrolling games, don't get me wrong, and I want a 3D Rayman, because as a kid, Rayman 2 was, in my opinion, one of the best games I played as a kid, and to this day, it's still one of my favorite games. But this is specifically, on a side note, why I like Watch Dogs 1 and 2 so much. Now, I prefer Watch Dogs 1, as much flack as that game got for both the graphics as well as some of the gameplay elements. I feel like having the story of Aiden Pierce be this unique, social commentary circa 2014 about social media and its effects, and how it would technically influence the future city of Chicago. I feel like that game touched on enough real world stuff that it was not preachy, it was not lectured. I didn't feel like I was attending a lecture. I felt like I was still enjoying a game that was taking place in a near futuristic world with enough things ties to reality that it felt realistic and enjoyable, while a decent introspective, but at the same time not being overbearing and unfun. And that, to me, is really the most I could ask from it, which is why I liked it. Now, the end of the game I didn't like as much. I thought it was a typical action game at the end. But up until the end of Act 3, which is, I believe, when you deal with a certain villain in the game, I thought it was a very fun experience. It was very interesting and unique, and I had a lot of fun playing it. And ideally, in the future, I will play it again. In the near future, that is. Now, Watch Dogs 2 tried to do that, but I felt like Watch Dogs 2 did not have a better protagonist. I felt that Marcus was not as driven. He wasn't as interesting. It also kind of ties in with the fact I feel like they made DedSec less ominous, less unknown, and more of like a very hipster kind of culture. And I wasn't a huge fan of it. And that's kind of why I'm not too interested in Watch Dogs Legion. I like when you have an open world game like that, and we have Watch Dogs 1 to really cement the style of game that it could be. I want to get back to those chapter 1, 2, and 3, or I think it might have been acts in Watch Dogs, acts 1, 2, and 3 of Watch Dogs 1, which unfortunately the game did not end on the same note as, nor did Marcus really ever take his story to that level either. And while Watch Dogs 2 was still an experience, it was still fun and enjoyable. I feel it was never the same, and it was not really ever as fun as Watch Dogs 1. And Legion will not have a central protagonist that I am aware of. The central protagonists of the first two games are really the anchor of their story. Needless to say, we experience the story through their eyes. We get to know them the most because we have the most on-screen time with them. And while there was a segment of Watch Dogs 2 where you play as other characters, you know, it was only for a brief mission. The major focus of the game is still playing as Marcus and playing as Aiden in the first game. And that's really what anchors these games and drives them home. Now, it also kind of, as an overarching part to this whole Ubisoft segment, it also spits kind of in the face of Ubisoft's ideology they used to plaster over every game. My understanding, which might be bad of it, is that they originally put it over Assassin's Creed because the first Assassin's Creed dealt with heavily religious topics to this day, which are still debated in various parts of the world. So by setting their game in the Middle East during the Crusades, you can't really get much more middle charge than that. That said, it spits in the face of saying that you have a game that's developed by a multicultural team of people of various faiths, genders, and all that other stuff, when you force them to write about stuff that might not be their topic of expertise. Maybe they might write a character really well that is more close to their ethnic or sexual background or sexual orientation. And because they have forced this upon them, it's the wrong thing to do. Like I said, forcing the writing and forcing certain things is never a good idea. It should be up to the creative directors, the writers, the people who are designing, I hate to use this word, designing the art to really sort of make it flow. Now, whether you want to say every game is art or not, I won't debate that because that's, again, a subjective topic. I could see both sides of it. But when it comes to creating a game, I think there is a very heavily artistic process between the graphic design, the writing, you know, the sound structure and the soundtrack, the effects, and et cetera, et cetera. It is definitely an artistic process. Whether or not the end result is art or just a product on a shelf, I leave that up to you. But I feel that Ubisoft, and I really want to focus on this in particular because everything else is pretty cut and dry. You know, obviously treating your employees badly is a bad thing. I don't think people would like it if the roles were reversed, if I'm not mistaken, correct? You would not want to be treated poorly, so you should not want to treat other people poorly. And if you do, I mean, you know, there's a certain degree of apologies, mistakes that will be made inevitably, but it's a problem at Ubisoft, and apparently it's been going for a long time. Now, do I think Assassin's Creed Odyssey would have been a much better game if Cassandra was the main character? It depends. And I know that's a non-answer, but I'm not really riding a fence. It depends what they did with Cassandra. Like I said, if they made her and took the time, since they were not putting in two playable characters, if they took the time then instead to flesh out her character more and make it more rewarding and you could really get behind her actions and her as a character more, then yes, I would agree that it would have been the right thing to do. However, if the whole purpose of it would just be to cut out an option and not change anything, then I think it would be the wrong thing to do because nothing would be added to the story. You would just be removing the choice from players who might otherwise have it. So ultimately, it really comes down to this one simple thesis, I guess I could throw out, is that if you're going to make a narrative-based game and you want it to focus heavily on one specific character, or, you know, maybe there could be another playable character here or there, but if you're going to have a narrative game with a static character, with a set backstory, that you want to tell their story and specifically only their story, and maybe there could be choices along the way. If you want to tell their story, then just tell it, and you should not be forced by upper management to tell a certain story revolving around the certain race and orientation and sex. However, at the end of the day, it needs to be good. And the same thing goes for the other side, where you have a character that is a blank slate. You can choose what you want from them. You can pick your gender, and maybe in some games you can go crazy with the customization. You know me, I always make a red-haired idiot that runs around who's man's, and that's cool and all, and maybe it's a bit easier because you could have this guy be a blank slate. However, the story needs to be good. That's, at the end of the day, there's no getting around it. The story needs to be good. And in Assassin's Creed, I don't know how long they've been running this tenant, because at this point I kind of forget. I didn't put in the notes, specifically how long this has apparently been a thing. I'm just going to assume since Ezio, right? I'm going to be real negative here and say that after Altair, they wanted Ezio and they want to be more relatable. Actually, I'm going to assume since, what's the guy's name? Kenway. I'm going to assume since Kenway, because Connor was Native American. At least with Kenway, I thought he was a good character. I thought Shay was a good character, despite his game being literally the shortest out of any Assassin's Creed. It's kind of funny that his game is the shortest, and I think he's the best out of the, between that and Unity. Unity, Syndicate, not that great. Odyssey, okay. I think Alexios does have moments. I know people shitpost that he's a very comedic actor. It's hard to take him seriously. I think there were a few serious moments in the story where Alexios... I think there was one moment in particular, I'll never find it because that playthrough is literally 80 hours long. There's one moment that stuck out to me, and I'm 1,000,000% sure it was about halfway through the game, that Alexios has a moment where he really struggles to believe that he will be able to reunite his family because they're all so hell-bent on killing each other or doing whatever and stuff like that. And that moment stuck with me because that's the kind of powerful story moment I feel games need. You need to have a moment. It's okay to have a moment where your character has weakness. And this is something that a lot of things do not get, especially with female protagonists. A lot of the greatest stories in video games that I can think of, the main character, usually male, is laid low. It's a very common thing in a hero's journey. It's a very common thing in writing. It's very simple to have a hero be human, to have faults, to have weaknesses, to maybe doubt themselves or to be too forgiving, and to have it bite them in the ass later. And a lot of choice-based games take advantage of that. I think that's a really good thing to have in a lot of games, is you have a humanizing element. If your character is just a Terminator who walks from A to B and kills everything in his way, it's not as relatable, unless that's the point of the game, like with Doom Eternal. We're not really supposed to relate to Doom Guy other than the fact that he's saving humanity, and we're just supposed to have fun. But I would hardly say that even Doom Eternal, with its endless codex entries, is the pinnacle of narrative-based storytelling. In fact, I'd say it's almost the antithesis, with how much the game focuses on action, 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 and no story almost takes a back seat. Maybe not as much as Doom 2016, but definitely more so than games like Ghost of Tsushima and Assassin's Creed. And that's totally fine, because the game is still fun and enjoyable. Okay, I think I've covered that for the most part. And I know that might be a hot take to somebody. That's how I feel. I feel that no matter what, your game's story should be good no matter what. And there have been good games with good stories, like, for instance, Tomb Raider 2013, even though I did not play the future sequels. I've never been a big Tomb Raider fan. I thought that it was a good origin story, a good reboot story, and I rather enjoyed it because I thought it told a pretty interesting story of Lara Croft from a more realistic backing, I guess. Needless to say, I like Metroid. I mean, Samus is a little bit of a silent protagonist, but I like her in the same vein that it's easy to like people like what's his name? Gordon Freeman. Gordon Freeman flat out never speaks, and people like him. His interactions are actually implied throughout the game. I'm trying to look for my water, I'm sorry. His interactions are implied throughout the game, and there's a degree of immersion in that. I'm not a fan of those types of games anymore. I think they've run their course. I think now narrative games can be a bit better than that, and that's why I prefer those. But like I said, some of the best characters, they have moments where they're weak. They have moments where they're helpless. And now, obviously, making them helpless too often sort of makes it feel like you need someone to bail you out every 5 minutes. But making them, relatable is also a very powerful thing. In Ghost of Tsushima, there's plenty of moments in the story where Jin is weakened, or Jin is at a defeat or at a loss. In Odyssey, there are moments where you are at, weak or at a loss for what to do. In Origins, there are points where you have no, what's going to happen to Bayek, who knows? And that's something that's very strong in a lot of these games, and why I like them so much is not only the gameplay, but getting behind the character in question and getting to know them is a very powerful thing that you can do in a game. It arguably drives the whole game forward. It also drives the medium forward too. Okay. Now that I've taken a sip, because that was quite a long topic, PlayStation 4 controllers will work on the PS5, but only next-gen games. Or, I'm sorry, but not for next-gen games. I'm sorry, I mistyped this. That, to me, is a no-brainer. I mean, you can use the PS4 on the PS3. It seems fairly straightforward. I lost my train of thought. I didn't understand why people were really upset about this. It seems simple to say that PS5 controllers will mandate a PS5... I'm sorry, PS5 games will mandate a PS5 controller. That seems like a very straightforward and understandable thing to say, is that you want to make sure that these games work on this controller. So without forcing someone to use a controller that might not be that great, it's definitely something, in my opinion, worth doing, and it's never an unwelcome feature. Now, again, the bigger point is how much PS5 controllers will cost. Undoubtedly, one will come with the console, but we also do not know how much the console will cost. And again, I think that factors into it, especially since there will be one with a disc drive and one without. And needless to say, you know me, I'm a collector of video games. I collect a lot. I have to get the disc drive one. That's just how it works if I am getting a PS5. So far, I don't think they've announced any true exclusives that are not also coming to PS4, at least not for the games that I am also interested in. What else do I have here? Actually, we don't have that many topics. Let's talk about something I do like before we talk about something that I am, or not that I don't like, but is also another topic that is kind of controversial. In the name of Wii U to Switch ports, Pikmin 3 Deluxe was announced. It will drop on October 30th. Why do I feel like it's October 31st? Oh god, you're killing me. Monolith worked? Alright, Monolith just works on everything, don't they? Yeah, October 30th, never mind. I was completely wrong. So, Pikmin 3, as I go back to my notes, Pikmin 3 Deluxe, which is an enhanced port of Pikmin 3, will drop on October 30th. It will include a Piclopedia, which was in the second game. I don't think it was in the first, as well as a prologue and an epilogue. So, it will also include new co-op missions. It will include all DLC from Pikmin 3, and it will also include side stories, which will feature Captain Olimar and, once again, everyone's favorite backstabber, Louis, as they explore the Pikmin planet. Can I click into this? Oh, crap. I gotta make images bigger on the podcast. It's a little bad. I gotta fix, like, the spacing. There will be two-player co-op on the same console. There won't be a gamepad. Remember, the Switch does not have a gamepad, so this will be a pure, more standard gameplay experience. I am very excited to play as Olimar again in this game. I believe that Olimar is the central point of the Pikmin storyline. Him being a family man and a very hard worker is very interesting to me. Again, Pikmin is not exactly what I would consider a heavily narrative-based game. However, I still appreciate and like it. I think Pikmin is Olimar's franchise. And while Alf and his friends might be cool and different, I do feel that having Olimar, and I mean, I guess you could get rid of Louis because I don't like him after Pikmin 2, is definitely something worth considering. I do appreciate it. There will be enemy balancing changes, which will be interesting. Hopefully they get rid of that one thing in the mud pit. They make him a joke. There will be enhanced lock-on targeting. There will be optional hints. There will be tons of other stuff. I'm excited. As Nintendo has said, they do not wish to simply port Wii U games to the Switch without actually changing anything. And while it might be a convenient way to get you to pay $60 again for a game that you already paid for before, it's at least a unique thing to do. It's at least something is being added as opposed to a lot of other remasters and ports, which generally have little to no changes between consoles. As a result of them announcing this, Pikmin 3 was removed from the Wii U eStore. I presume if you already bought it, you can re-download it again for free, much like Meme Run, which I still have on my Wii U. And obviously they're not done. There's a lot of Wii U exclusive games that remain exclusive to the console. However, I will say, I listed them here. I'm confident that at least a lot of these will be re-released on either the Switch or another console later on. For instance, they are, in no particular order, Super Mario 3D World. Xenoblade X is the one that everyone on Twitter was basically saying do next. Now, granted, just this year they announced Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, which I still will jump into. I would like to jump into it. Zelda Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess HD, also were not re-released yet. Yoshi's Woolly World, Paper Mario Color Splash, Star Fox Zero, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse, and, I mean, I saw someone throw this out, Devil's Third. I believe there's also a Fatal Frame game that has not been ported. There's a lot of games that kind of need to be ported and fixed up, in my opinion, because they do not function off of a gamepad. Once again, the gamepad being probably the most damning feature of the Wii U, besides the name. Definitely something that has come back to haunt them. However, I am glad to see that they are at least committed to their lesser games, like, for instance, Pikmin 3, which was a game, and specifically the reason I bought a Wii U in the first place. Oh. Okay. Now, one thing that I did say and did see is that Epic and Apple are basically suing each other over Fortnite on the App Store. I didn't really look into this that much because I thought it was more hilarious that Epic Games made an almost call to arms against Apple using a 1984 style Fortnite skit. They must have like some movie projection servers or something in Fortnite where they just show this stuff. It's really weird. It's also really dystopian in a very weird way. Epic is not really helping any consumers by doing this. This is more of Epic trying to get more of the pie, and they don't want to pay Apple, who is the middleman hosting this thing. I think what it really boils down to, and again, I've not looked into it, so I may be uninformed on this especially, is that Epic wanted to try to either bypass the Apple method of paying for microtransactions on their on the program offered on the App Store, and it's also been pulled off Android now. I should probably put that as well. It's also been pulled off the Android store as well. I cannot spell today. And I don't know if they're suing Google, but I know that they are at least suing Apple. And it'll be interesting to see where this goes in 20 years when they're done bankrupting each other's, court funds over this. But it's definitely something that I feel like if Apple doesn't want to host it, I mean, they don't have to host it. It's their service. And especially if Epic, I believe, is violating some rule, it would make sense why they would say, hey, knock that off or you can't come back. And I personally just found it more funny that they had the 1984 skit, like Apple is some super dystopian company, when Epic is also a gigantic dystopian company, especially one that is now lecturing its followers in-game about where to go to war and who is the enemy. I think that's always a very tasteful thing to do in video games, is when companies directly point and name drop the finger at each other over Twitter. And needless to say, that is something that they might have very much learned from the president. For better or for worse. I'll leave that distinction up to you, viewer. Now, there was also something with Cyberpunk, where the Cyberpunk writers stated that Cyberpunk 2077 will not be edited in the aftermath of the George Floyd United States protests. Now, it's very hard for almost anyone in the world to deny one of two things going on. One being the mysterious illness that has completely crippled the global economy and killed, I believe at this point, over 1 million, as well as the racial tensions and unrest in the United States of America that have started sweeping the country and have been for quite some time. In late May, an officer in Minneapolis kneeled and remained on the neck of African-American male George Floyd for, I believe, approximately 9 minutes, after which George Floyd later died. And since then, it has led to a bunch of peaceful protests as well as riots. There's been a lot of both, and this is to be honest, this is to be very, very straightforward. It's led to heightened tensions about policing and police treatment of minorities, as well as just in general African American rights. There is a very big portion of the country that is experiencing some form of this. Some places have had nonstop riots since this happened. There have been defundings in police departments across the country, as well as flat out disbanding of certain portions of police departments. Whether that's for the better or worse, I will leave that for a political podcast to discuss. It's not, my views on this are not really relevant to the topic at hand. My views on the topic at hand is that somehow the Cyberpunk writer was either asked or made a statement about this, in which point he responded that the game is not a political statement or a political thesis. Now, that is a heavy summary. There is a bigger quote to this, but a lot of people were very taken aback and very disgusted by this change, or this stance that he took. Really briefly, I would like to remind everyone, and I could literally leave this at this, that the game was originally due to be out in May 2020. And I could leave it there because the game, which was originally due out to be in 2020, is essentially already finished. In fact, at the time of me making this podcast, it is only about 3 months out from being released. Now, to edit and to even just to add in certain things at this stage of development might further delay the game, or it might lead to the game being of an inferior quality than what it could have been. And that's not to cite and not to say that the message that could be incorporated in the game is bad. In fact, I'd argue that it fits perfectly with the idea of cyberpunk, which is that either dystopian futures, governments, and or corporations have oppressed the middle working class into a point that it's almost like a modern day horror. There's nothing against that cannot be in the game. However, and like I generally prefer to say about a lot of games that take place in this, is that I do not, once again, prefer my games to be lectures, and I prefer my games to be fun. Now, race rights is not a joke in a serious connotation. I'm a born shitposter. I make humor about a lot of things. I make jokes about a lot of things. But as someone who is African American, I feel that my games should still be just that. They should be games. They should be products. You can have things like this in products, but it needs to be conveyed in a way that, like I always say, should not be a lecture. I do not buy games to be lectured about race riots. I do not buy games to be lectured about racial policies. However, weaving that into the narrative of the game not only strengthens the game, but at the same time makes it a meaningful message that can be taken away from. And that is something that I think is totally fine within the context of cyberpunk. However, they are not obligated to do that. They are not obligated to put in especially real world references into a game such in this manner. And if they do not want to do it, then that's fine. That's totally up to them. Now, what he did say about the game not being a political statement or a political thesis is kind of a weird statement to make, because cyberpunk as a genre is a very heavily political thing. It is naturally involved with the overbearing presence of governments and corporations taking over increasingly large chunks of society and people's personal lives. I mean, it's kind of by default, the politics are baked in. And while racial treatment could be associated and attributed to a part of that, and it may very well be within the context of the game, if they don't want to have racial tensions and race treatment be a portion of their game, they are more than happy to omit or skip that. And just because it's in the game does not mean it's in the game well, does not mean it will automatically make everybody happy about it. In fact, there will be a lot of cases of people maybe saying that it's just token representation, it's not well implemented. It's the same sort of thing that I was talking about with Ubisoft and forcing white male protagonists. It's okay to have a straight white male protagonist. It's not okay to force it on companies and developers to have it, or that's it. It's the bottom line. It's the idea that people should be able to create what they want. They should be able to create what they feel most comfortable creating for the vast market at large. And there can be plenty of people, plenty of games that touch on racism. However, there's never really been a game that has been solely about racism to my knowledge, and largely in part because that would probably just end up being a documentary. And that's not to say that's bad, but that's not the purpose of a video game, which at its core is meant to be something done for fun or enjoyment. And a lot of times these topics are neither fun nor enjoyable to bring up. I'm sure that a lot of people who have, well, I don't know how many people have listened to my previous podcasts, but a lot of the times the topics are not very fun or enjoyable, and this is one of them. You can have moments of serious topics within games. Does not mean that you have to omit them entirely, but to designate perhaps an entire mission structure or portion of the game to it might be out of the skill scope of the writers to make it fit naturally within the scope of the game, or just in general, so on and so forth. I don't really want to get too bogged down in this. It might not be a topic that they feel comfortable tackling. It might be something that, even when they do tackle it, will not be a very heavily remembered part of the game. It, like, just to do something for Twitter clout and a couple of check marks to agree with is not exactly the right way to make games. I feel like movies have started to do that, and I feel it's been to the detriment of movie storyline and quality as well. And it would be, again, good to see if it's done well. And one of the games I cite for this is LA Noire. LA Noire has a very, very gritty depiction of 1940s America, as only Rockstar could deliver it. And needless to say, there's a lot of very uncomfortable racial tensions as well as sexual tensions in the game, not like between characters, but as in how people are perceived and treated and looked upon in society. And there's a lot, and that's a look back at a time in America which is now almost 80 years removed in some cases, but is a very romanticized time in media. A lot of things will have noir-style buddy cop shows, and it's something that is long gone, but it is still correct and true to that time period, at least as much as they could, while keeping the game as fun as they could. And I mean, LA Noire got a lot of flack for not having multiplayer and other things in it. It was a entirely single-player based game that maybe focused a little bit too heavily on that 1940s nostalgia. And in fact, this is one thing I actually wanted from a specific game that later sucked a bunch of dick anyway, which was XCOM: The Bureau Declassified. Needless to say, unlike Black Ops, which takes place in a similar time period but is more focused on the war elements of the 1960s and 70s, it would have been well within the scope of XCOM: The Bureau to maybe take a moment, not be a Mass Effect 2 clone, which is what the game really ended up being, and focus more on the atmosphere of Cold War 1960s America. I don't need to tell you, because you can crack open a history book, you could watch tons of documentaries about it, or you could even talk to people who lived during that time, how much of a turbulent time it was. Although anyone will say any period in history was turbulent, something was always going on. For instance, there were racial tensions. Much like we have today, there were people like Malcolm X, there were people like Martin Luther King, and a lot of them were assassinated and or arrested. There were a lot of racial riots back then, as there were also in the 90s, which was also included in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which in my opinion was to the benefit of the game. However, the entire game does not focus on the 1992 LA riots. In fact, it's only a portion of the game towards the end where it actually is at least something that's either building or actually in effect. And that's the kind of thing I think that's good. Using it as context to have a good mission or a good storyline within your game is never a bad thing. I think that that's including it can be a benefit when done well. Because at the end of the day, I prefer games to be well written. How much they take from real life is up to the writer and how well they can implement it in the story. Needless to say, a lot of these games have stories that people like and will agree are at least good to great to amazing. And being able to write is a talent that is very hard to grasp. I know because I've tried to write, and everyone's their harshest critic, but I know that my writing is garbage. So for them to put it in a paid product and stand by it and have it be good is an accomplishment in and of itself, and that's something that they should be very proud of. And to do that, it's not just as easy as just dropping in, name-dropping stuff that happened, unless it's for some direct reference that gets pushed over. For instance, Medal of Honor in 2011, I believe, dropped the killing of Osama bin Laden. It was some game that back then that dropped the killing of, I believe, bin Laden, or something. I think bin Laden, it might have been Medal of Honor Warfighter. And I remember back then, it got flack for it, and I could look it up. Do I really have to? Are you going to make me look it up? Are you going to hate me for it? I think it was Medal of Honor. It was some killing. Let me see. This is going to be a great thing to see in my search history in like a year. Was it bin Laden? Crap. There was a game that had it. I don't remember. And I'm not going to find it. But I know Medal of Honor I think it might have been Medal of Honor Warfighter. They might have specifically name dropped it, or it might have been a Battlefield game. And of course, Battlefield has now since killed Medal of Honor, which is unfortunate because I feel that while Battlefield can have the multiplayer element, Medal of Honor having its very, gritty sort of storyline would be much more interesting, as a campaign at least, because by God, the fucking Battlefield campaigns have been bad besides Hardline for the last decade. And even that was met with a lot of interest, if not distaste, if not just, I don't want to say apathy, just neutrality. Like, it's a way to ground your game, to say, like, oh, it might have been Battlefield 3. I don't remember, and I'm not going to look it up any more than this. But I know they referenced something, and I know it made some people upset, but in general, most people kind of don't care. In fact, especially with first-person shooters, a lot of times people don't really give a shit about the campaigns. A lot of times they just skip to the multiplayer, and they just play the multiplayer, because that's primarily what those games are for. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes when you put it in, just because you put in stuff doesn't mean that it's automatically good. And it doesn't matter, like, you might feel very strongly about certain movements and about certain things like racial relations and police brutality of minorities, but just because you put it into a game might not necessarily make it good. It could be good, it could be bad, depending how shoehorned in it is. And it's the same stance I had with Odyssey, where in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, just because Cassandra could have been the only protagonist does not automatically mean that the game would have been better because she was the only protagonist, nor because she is a woman. That is, I believe, a false equivalency, because there are loads of games that have female protagonists that are bad. There are loads of games that have male protagonists that are bad. There are loads of games that have straight people as protagonists that are bad. And just because you put these things in does not automatically make the game good. I mean, if you want to say that you'd be okay with a bad game that has representation, that's fine, but just know that a video game developer is not a charity. They need to make returns on the game at some point so that they can continue to make games. And generally speaking, they tend to make games that reflect the industry as it is currently. For instance, when QuickTime events were popular in games, every game had a QuickTime event. Every action game had a QuickTime event. They wouldn't tell you they were in the game. They would just throw it at you, and if you failed it, go fuck yourself. And I mean, that was annoying back then. Remember that? That was like a good 10 years where every game had a QuickTime event. Nowadays, you don't really see them anymore because people kind of grew out of that phase where they felt it was like forced interaction with the game. All it really did was test your reflexes in a very cheap manner usually, because having a lot of time to react to it defeats the purpose, and having no time to react to it without knowing it's coming up generally means the game feels cheap. And that's why some games that do have them, like Spider-Man 2018, have options to either make it so you just hold the button or to remove them altogether. And most games in general do not have it outside of maybe simple storyline elements to maybe break up the immersion, but they're not really required. There's a lot of things that games have done. A lot of games used to be Metal Gear clones and have vast, long cutscenes with tons of diatribe in them and looking at you, Other M, and that didn't necessarily make the games more cinematic or movie-like. It just meant that large chunks of the game are spent watching movies and you don't really get to do anything else, much like the Order 1886. A large chunk of game, and now the new thing is microtransactions and shit like that, which is more of a benefit to the game developer and publisher as it is to the player. In fact, I'd argue having to spend more money to maybe to bring yourself on equal footing as other players is inherently a bad game design choice, but I digress because I very rarely play any games like that unless you want to count MMOs. Long story short, there is nothing to excuse what happened in real life to George Floyd. There can be things that maybe paint a clearer picture. However, the actions of at least the main officer who did the, I believe it's Derek Chauvin, the actions of Mr. Chauvin and how he treated him and ultimately at least aided, if not was the direct cause of Floyd's murder, are inexcusable on almost any capacity. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I believe that every reasonable person listening to this video can agree to that. There is nothing against having peaceful protests and having large-scale movements to talk about this and to make this more acceptable in the span of not only just the United States, but also around the world in general. Nothing wrong with that at all. However, within the confines of a game, especially one that was already due out originally before any of this actually happened and it was only delayed due to feedback from journalists, take that as you will, I do not necessarily believe that just dumping it in the game would be the correct thing to do. It depends on the writing, it depends on how they implement it, and it depends on the actual content thereof. Even something as simple as the voice acting of characters in a quest can completely paint differently how people feel and interact and associate with it, as well as just the things within the quest, the objectives, how it's laid out. There's a lot more in a game than just dumping real world events for reference points, and dumping stuff for real world reference points is not always necessarily a great thing in general. I think it might have been a Battlefield game now that I think about it. Something we don't want to fuck up like Bin Laden, I think it was. This is some shit that happened years before I did the podcast, and if I had done it back then, I would have certainly covered it, because it was a really hilarious thing that they even put in a fucking game. It might have been Battlefield 3. Can I find it? Yeah, Bin Laden reference in the single player of Battlefield 3. And to quote, this is from a GameFAQs board by Ninja Man 148 8 years ago, to give you an idea of how long ago this was. The Splinter Cell game was come on the horizon. To kind of quote this this GameFAQs board for a little bit, he says, I believe it's on the mission Night Shift when you and Sergeant Campo meet with Captain Cole and the rest of the platoon. I believe Campo asked Cole about Al-Bashir, to which Captain Cole says, no, we need Al-Bashir alive, Sergeant. I don't want another fucking Bin Laden resolution here. Now move. Something like that. And I'm taking his quote. I do think I remember this, because then I believe you go in through a door or something. I don't remember the rest of that campaign. It kind of went in one ear out, or went in one eye out the other, if that doesn't make any sense at all. It was a reference, and perfectly, Peril actually summarizes this, in my opinion, properly. It was a pretty neat reference, but it kind of dates the game. That is exactly one thing that will happen, actually, is that you will date the game. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I mean, if you want to look at Battlefield 3's campaign as the context of something that takes place in the fictional year of whatever year it takes place in, then yeah, sure. But when you have real-world events like that, especially a direct name drop, you definitely kind of get the feeling that you know this was made at a certain time period. Just like how in one of the TV shows I really liked recently, Mr. Robot has a picture of Donald Trump, or has a video scene of Donald Trump accepting the nomination of presidency and being sworn into office, I believe it was. And while it is a comment and critique about the government structure of the United States of America, to summarize it very heavily, it is definitely something that in 20, 30, 40 years, if someone were to watch this show, you would need extra context in order to understand why it was such a controversial thing that Donald Trump won the United States presidency. That said, and that aside, it is something that will date the game. Sometimes being dated is a good thing. However, sometimes, especially when it's done for name drop points, it can just make the game feel old and just really take you out of context. A story about honor and duty and doing the right thing by people generally will not date as much as something that directly references something that people like or something related. Like, you could have stories about honor and duty and be a criminal. I mean, that is, in fact, ironically, what San Andreas is about. It's something about the families and sticking together and doing the right thing by you and yours, and defending that against the people who want to sell out and to make money at the cost of their fellow man. And I mean, obviously, maybe that's a little bit more poetic than the game puts it. However, that sort of thing can transcend time periods. You could play a game that takes place in the year 2070 or whatever, which is Ghost of Tsushima, and it will still hold true. Doing right by the people you love, protecting what you care about, and ensuring that they are defended and saved by your hand. That is something that you could find in almost any game, including futuristic games that are fictional. And obviously, there's a certain degree of video games are just being played that's being thrown in there, but with at some level you can at least maybe reach back behind the surface and find it. All right. I talked way longer than I should. I thought this podcast was legitimately only going to be maybe like an hour or two. So I might put some gameplay footage over this. I might not, because of the serious topics within. And because of that, I hope that at least some of it makes sense. I hope it gives a little bit more... you don't necessarily have to agree with me, but I hope it gives a little more context as to why I feel personally that some of these things are the right thing to do if they are done correctly, and otherwise the wrong thing. And that goes for a lot of things in general. Just having a sex scene in a video game does not inherently make it better, regardless of who is involved. Again, that is kind of my issue with The Last of Us. What? Oh, Naughty Dog, what the fuck? What a game. But anyway, I've talked for too long. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the podcast. I hope it has been at least somewhat informative, or at least just been something fun to listen to while you do something else. I will be trying to do these more regularly, so I do not have to sit here and talk for almost 90 minutes about stuff you probably don't give a flying fuck about. However, hopefully it was at least worth your time, and I will see you on something future on this channel.